At 76, Helen thought the wildest thing left in her life was the wind in the pines and the chatter of the radio selling Medicare plans and home insurance. She never imagined she'd end up wedged at the bottom of a dark canyon, leg broken, staring up the barrel of a poacher's rifle while he argued whether an old woman was worth a murder charge. Just as her world narrowed to that cold black circle, 4 low, powerful shapes appeared on the rim above. This wasn't a scene from a movie. It was 4 grown bobcats, the same helpless cubs she'd once cradled in a laundry basket and fed by hand, coming back into her life in a way no one in Pine Hollow would ever forget. Helen Carter liked that the pavement ended before it reached her. The blacktop thinned to cracked tar, then to gravel, then finally to the dusty 2-track that wound through the pines toward her cabin. Delivery drivers hated it. Tourists in rental cars sometimes turned around halfway, afraid they'd gone the wrong way. But for Helen, the little ruts and washboards on that last stretch of road felt like a polite reminder that she was leaving the noise of the world behind. Her cabin sat where the pines opened just enough to let the sky through, a squat shape of weathered boards and a green metal roof with a stone chimney that still remembered the smoke of 100 winters. Behind it, the hills rose up into the Mogollon Rim like the back of some sleeping giant, ridged and silent. In the evening, when the wind slid down through the trees, you could hear the highway, faintly, if you listened hard. Helen never listened that hard. At 76, she moved a little slower than she used to, but her hands were still steady. They had to be. Those hands had once stitched up young soldiers in field hospitals, wrapped bandages under the whine of helicopters, held the trembling fingers of boys who were far too young to be dying. Later, those same hands had held her husband's when the cancer took him, one long night at the VA hospital down in Phoenix. After he was gone, she'd brought her grief up here to the high country where the air was thin and clean, and the silence could hold it without comment. Her days followed a gentle pattern now. Morning started with coffee in the dented blue enamel mug her husband had favored on camping trips. She'd sit on the front porch while the sky turned from purple to pale gold, listening to the soft cluck of her hens in the coop and the rustle of something small moving through the underbrush. The old transistor radio on the kitchen counter would murmur about interest rates, Medicare supplement plans, and car insurance deals she had no intention of calling about. It made her feel less alone, somehow, knowing there were still commercials and politicians and weather reports chattering away out there. After breakfast, she checked the hens, gathered whatever eggs they had seen fit to offer, then tended her little vegetable patch out back. Tomatoes in raised beds, a row of beans climbing up string, a stubborn patch of basil that refused to die even when the nights turned cold. Kneeling on her foam pad, she'd stretch her aching knees and think, not for the first time, that at least she wasn't stuck in some apartment complex, staring at beige walls and arguing with an automated phone tree about her prescription drug coverage. Most afternoons, she drove her dusty Subaru into Pine Hollow, the little town that clung to the highway like a burr on a pant leg. There, in a cramped room behind the pharmacy, she volunteered twice a week, checking blood pressure and glucose numbers for a rotating cast of old ranchers, retired teachers, and a surprising number of Vietnam and Desert Storm vets. She'd show them how to read their numbers, remind them gently about their blood pressure meds and hearing aids, and tease them into talking about something besides their aches and pains. Her closest neighbor, if you could call a man half a mile away the neighbor, was Earl. He'd been a Marine once, before his knees went bad. Now he lived in a sagging trailer with a porch full of potted cacti and a dog that barked at everything but coyotes. Every few days he'd rumble up her road in his pickup, bringing a bag of feed, a spare part, or gossip from town. In return, Helen checked his medications, nagged him to lay off the salt, and listened to the same 3 stories about the same 3 battles without complaint. One Tuesday, as the days were just starting to grow longer again and the snowmelt ran in little silver threads down the ditches, Sheriff Tom Riley stopped by. His cruiser rolled to a halt in a puff of dust, and he climbed out, stretching his back like a man who'd spent too many hours in a car seat. He was in his early 50s now, tall and starting to gray at the temples, but Helen still saw the 16-year-old kid who'd once knocked on her door in a panic after cutting his hand on a rusted fence, certain he'd die of tetanus before sunrise. He accepted a mug of coffee and stood with her on the porch, looking out toward the tree line. "You heard the talk about the logging company?" he asked. "Earl's been chewing on it like a dog on a bone," Helen said. "Something about them wanting to cut a road closer into the rim." Tom nodded, jaw tight. "They're pushing for easements, nothing signed yet, but with that comes more traffic, more people who don't belong here. We've already found fresh bait piles and a couple of illegal traps up near the old fire road." "Snares?" Helen asked. "And trip wire rigs," he said. "Folks trying to get around the regular hunting seasons. I just want you to be careful, that's all. You're right at the end of the line out here. If somebody decides they don't want witnesses, a home security system won't do you much good with no one close enough to hear it." She snorted softly. "I've got better protection than that. I've got old age. Nobody thinks an old woman is worth the trouble." "Don't bet your life on that, Helen," he said, and she heard the worry under his joking tone. "At least keep that medical alert necklace on you when you're out back, okay? I'd rather get a false alarm than a phone call from a hiker who found you at the bottom of a wash." She patted the little pendant under her flannel shirt. She wore it more for Nathan's sake than her own, but she didn't say that. "I'll be careful," she promised. Later that night, after Tom's cruiser lights had faded down the hill and the last of the dishes were put away, Helen eased herself into bed with an old paperback mystery. The wind had picked up, sliding through the pines in long, low sighs. Somewhere in the distance, a truck engine downshifted on the highway and then was gone. She clicked off the lamp eventually, letting the cabin settle around her in the dark. The refrigerator hummed. The clock in the kitchen ticked. From the coop came a sleepy rustle as one of the hens shifted on her roost. Then, as she was drifting toward sleep, she heard it. Faint at first, almost lost under the wind. A thin, ragged sound from somewhere beyond the gravel drive, above the whisper of the trees. It wasn't the yip of a coyote or the hoot of an owl. It was higher, more desperate, like the crying of something very small and very afraid. Helen held her breath, listening. The sound came again, a choked, hitching wail that raised the hairs on her arms. She sat up slowly, the bed springs creaking, and glanced toward the dark window where the pines loomed like a wall. "Now, what on earth?" she murmured, swinging her legs over the edge of the bed, not knowing that the choice she made in the next few minutes would change everything that lonely little cabin had ever seen. By morning, the sound from the night before felt almost like a dream. Helen told herself it had probably been a fox or a stray dog wandering through, something the hens would have complained about if it had come too close. The day started ordinary enough. Coffee on the porch, a pale ribbon of sun fighting through thin clouds, the radio murmuring about storms moving in from the west, and another segment about Medicare Advantage plans that made her roll her eyes and turn the volume down. She needed feed for the hens and a refill on one of her prescriptions, so by early afternoon she was steering the Subaru down the 2-track, tires crunching on gravel. The sky over Pine Hollow had turned the color of old tin by the time she reached town. Folks at the pharmacy door were already glancing upward, pulling jackets tighter, commenting on how the high country storms came fast this time of year. "Better not linger," the pharmacist warned as she tucked Helen's pills into a paper bag. "They're saying hail up on the rim. Don't want you sliding off into a ditch." "I've done worse," Helen said lightly. But she didn't linger. She waved at Earl's truck outside the diner, considered stopping for pie, then thought of the looming clouds and headed for the edge of town instead. Rain was already spotting the windshield when she crossed the little bridge over Dry Creek. By the time the asphalt thinned to patched tar and then to gravel, it was a steady, needling curtain. The wipers thumped back and forth, struggling to keep up, and the road ahead blurred into slick gray and pine trunks. She slowed to a crawl, hands tight on the wheel, reminding herself this was why she kept good all-weather tires and paid extra for car insurance that would actually answer the phone if she ended up in a ditch. A flash of movement on the shoulder made her foot slam the brake. The Subaru slid a little, ABS chattering, then caught. Helen's heart jumped up into her throat. Through the watery glass she saw it, a crumpled shape in the runoff channel, tawny fur darkened by rain. One hind leg twisted at an angle that made her stomach clench. She eased the car to the side, hazard lights blinking weakly in the downpour, and stepped out. The rain felt colder than it looked, needling her face and soaking through her jacket in seconds. She kept one hand on the car for balance as she made her way toward the shape. It was a bobcat, full-grown, the head turned slightly as if listening to something that wasn't there anymore. The eyes were already glazing, a thin trickle of blood washing pink in the water swirling around its paws. "Poor girl," Helen murmured. She'd seen enough broken bodies to recognize the abrupt violence of it. Some speeding truck, someone too busy thinking about their next text message or comparing life insurance quotes to notice a wild animal dart into the road. Then she heard it. Under the drum of the rain and the distant hiss of passing tires, there was another sound. A faint, scratchy keening that seemed to come from the brush just beyond the culvert. Not the deep, warning growl of a grown bobcat, but something higher and thin, like the whimper of a baby that had cried itself nearly hoarse. Helen squinted through the rain, moving past the dead mother to the tangle of rabbit brush and scrub oak. The sound came again, more urgent now. She shoved a branch aside and froze. 4 tiny shapes were huddled under the low branches, soaked to the skin, tufts of spotted fur plastered against bony ribs. Their ears were too big for their heads, their eyes wide and unfocused, still holding that bluish cast that meant they hadn't been looking at the world for very long. One tried to hiss at her and only managed a strangled squeak. Another lay half on its side, sides heaving, too tired even to complain. "Oh, sweetheart," Helen breathed. "You picked one heck of a day to lose your mama." They smelled of damp fur and fear, of milk and earth. One of them tried to tuck itself deeper under its siblings as she leaned closer, as if a 12-ounce bundle of bones could hide the others too. Helen pulled her phone from her pocket with stiff fingers and punched in a familiar number. It rang twice before a breathless young voice answered, loud against the patter of rain. "Pine Hollow Wildlife Rescue, this is Lena." "Lena, it's Helen Carter," she said. "I'm on the road about 3 miles past the Dry Creek Bridge. I've got a dead bobcat in the ditch and 4 kits alive in the brush." There was a sharp inhale on the other end. 4. "Are you sure?" "I'm looking right at them," Helen said. "They're little, eyes open, but not by much. They're soaked through. I don't think they've been alone long." Lena swore softly under her breath, then caught herself. "Sorry, ma'am. Okay. I'm checking the radar right now. We've got golf ball hail hitting just south of you. If I put the truck on that road in this, I'll be in the ditch, and then nobody gets anywhere. Can you do anything where you are?" Helen glanced back at the Subaru, at the way the rain was already flowing like a shallow river across the gravel. "I can't just leave them," she said. "I know," Lena replied, voice tight. "We are full up down here right now. I've got fox kits in dog crates and a fawn in my laundry room. But if those babies stay out there, they'll die. Hypothermia or coyotes, or they'll wander into the road and get hit too. If you can get them warm and dry for the night, I can come up as soon as the weather clears and the sheriff says the road's safe." Helen's mind ticked through possibilities. She thought of her little living room, the throw blankets on the couch, the old wood stove that still held heat long after the fire died down. She thought of late-night commercials about home security systems and medical alert devices, all the ways the world tried to tell people like her to be afraid of every shadow. And then she looked at the 4 shivering, miserable bundles under the bush, too small to be anything but helpless. "I've still got some formula powder from when you sent me that orphaned raccoon last spring," she said slowly. "And a couple of hot water bottles. I can rig something. I was a nurse before you were born, remember?" "I remember," Lena said. "If anyone can keep them alive until morning, it's you. Just be careful. They're wild, even if they're tiny. Towels around your hands, no bare fingers near their mouths. And Helen? Don't get too attached. Once they're stable, they'll have to come here, and eventually they'll go back out there where they belong." Helen made a non-committal sound, but her eyes were already on the kits. "Just get here when you can. I'll text you when I'm back at the cabin." She ended the call, slid the phone into her pocket, and shrugged out of her jacket, ignoring the cold bite of the rain on her shoulders. One by one, she reached into the brush, wrapping each trembling body in a fold of damp flannel and holding them tight against her chest so they could feel the steadiness of her heartbeat. The boldest one squirmed and tried to complain. The weakest simply sagged, a tiny, exhausted weight in her hands. Loaded down with 4 frightened lives and a paper bag of pills, Helen picked her way back to the car. When she eased the Subaru onto the road again, the wipers beating double time, she felt the weight of the storm pressing in on all sides. But inside her jacket, pressed against her ribs, there was a different kind of weight now, too. Warm, fragile, and insistent, like a promise she hadn't meant to make, but could no longer imagine breaking. The rain chased Helen all the way home, drumming on the Subaru's roof while the heater wheezed warm air at the windshield. By the time she bumped into her usual spot beside the porch, the yard was a shallow lake and the pine branches were dripping steady silver strings. She shut off the engine, gathered the warm, squirming bundle under her jacket, and hurried inside. The cabin smelled of coffee grounds and old wood. She set the paper bag of prescriptions on the table and opened her jacket. 4 damp, spotted faces blinked up at her, whiskers trembling, eyes still too big for their heads. One gave a feeble hiss that came out as more of a squeak. "All right, troops," she murmured. "Let's see what we can do." The training she'd carried out of Vietnam and into a lifetime of nursing rose up like muscle memory. She flipped on the kettle, lit the wood stove, and went rooting through the pantry until she found the dented canister of animal formula Lena had mailed her last spring. On the fridge, still taped under a magnet advertising a Medicare supplement hotline, were Lena's mixing directions in neat blue ink. "Warm, not hot," Helen read aloud. "Slow, steady feedings. No rushing. Same rule as a good car insurance policy, I suppose." She lined an old laundry basket with towels and an Afghan, then slid a couple of hot water bottles along the sides. One by one she moved the kits from her jacket into the nest. They shivered and squirmed, tiny claws snagging the fabric, but when she tucked a towel loosely over the top, the wild edge in their cries softened. Feeding them was slow work. She wrapped her hands in thin dishcloths and offered the first bottle. The boldest kit fought it for a moment, then latched on so hard she had to steady his head. The second chewed sideways until milk dribbled down his chin. The third fell asleep with the nipple still in his mouth. The smallest only took a few drops at a time, resting between each, thin ribs fluttering under her fingers like a frightened bird. Outside, wind rattled the eaves and rain slapped the windows hard enough to make the lights flicker. Inside, there was only the soft sound of swallowing, the tiny hiccups of bellies not used to being full. Her knees complained about the time on the floor, but her heart felt oddly quiet, focused. She had spent years listening to commercials about home security systems and personal injury lawyers telling people to be afraid of everything. Right now, all the danger in the world had narrowed down to 4 fist-sized lives in a laundry basket. "You need names," she said at last, easing the last bottle away. 4 small bodies lay in a tangle, bellies round, paws twitching in sleep. "Can't go on calling you, 'Hey you.'" She studied them, letting instinct do what it always had. The sturdy one with the darker stripe down his back, the fighter at the bottle, became Flint. The bold little hissy one was Bramble. The dreamy, slow-poke kit, always half a beat behind, she called Sage. And the smallest, who had clung hardest to her fingers and the nipple, she named Juniper, for the tough little trees that clung to the rock faces along the rim. "Plants and rocks," she murmured, "things that hang on when the weather turns bad." She snapped a quick picture on her phone, 4 damp dots of fur curled together near the stove, and texted it to Lena with 3 words: "Home, warm, eating." The reply came almost at once. "You're a miracle. I'll check the road with the sheriff in the morning. Remember, they're wild, temporary." Temporary. Helen knew all about that word. She'd heard every warning about wild animals, about liability and rabies shots, and what could happen if somebody got hurt and called a personal injury attorney. These were not house cats, and this was not a pet adoption. Still, when one of the kits let out a tiny sigh and buried its face against its brother's neck, something deep in her chest answered anyway. Headlights swept briefly across the front window. A second later, there was a knock at the door, firm and familiar. Helen pushed herself to her feet, joints cracking, and opened it to find Earl on the porch, hat dripping, jacket beaded with rain. "Power's out at my place," he said. "Trees are coming down by the highway. Figured I'd make sure you hadn't floated off." "I'm still here," she said. "Come in before you rust." He stomped his boots and stepped inside, already reaching for the flashlight that always hung by her door. His eyes caught on the basket by the stove. A spotted ear twitched. Bramble's head popped up, eyes narrowed to slits. "What in the blazes is that?" he demanded. Helen followed his gaze. "Orphans," she said, keeping her voice even. "Their mama's in the ditch down the hill. I'm just keeping them alive until Lena can get up here." Earl let out a low whistle. "Those are bobcats, Helen, not kittens from the feed store. You trying to get your face rearranged and end up suing somebody on TV?" "They're more scared of us than we are of them," she answered. "Right now, they're wet, hungry, and half frozen. We can argue about the rest later." He grumbled, but he moved closer anyway, leaning over the basket. One of the kits sniffed the air and gave a tiny, uncertain chirp. "Well, I'll be," he muttered. "Ugly little cusses. Kind of cute, though." He stayed long enough for a cup of coffee and another reminder that if she needed help, his truck had a full tank and his phone was charged. When he left, shutting the door on a gust of wet wind, the cabin felt both quieter and somehow less empty. Later, as the fire settled to a red glow and the storm finally began to move off toward the next ridge, Helen stretched out on the couch with her old quilt over her legs. The basket sat on the rug within easy reach. Every so often, one of the kits twitched or made a soft sound, and she would lift the edge of the towel just enough to see 4 small shapes breathing in the orange light. She knew the morning would bring talk of transport crates and quarantine, and the fact that no amount of love could turn a bobcat into a safe-house pet. But as her eyes grew heavy and the wind quieted in the pines, all she could think was that for the first time in a long while, the cabin at the end of the road did not feel like a place for just one old woman anymore. By the time spring slid into summer, the little recovery ward in Helen's living room looked less like a nursery and more like a jungle gym designed by a committee of lunatics. The laundry basket had long since been retired. In its place were 2 large dog crates pushed together. An old bookcase turned on its side as a climbing frame, and a parade of battered throw pillows that had given their lives in the line of duty. Bramble was always the first to test the boundaries. He learned how to unlatch the crate door by watching Helen's fingers, and one memorable morning she shuffled out of her bedroom to find him sitting proudly on top of the refrigerator, tail flicking, a stolen dish towel hanging from his mouth like a flag. Flint preferred to stalk dust motes in the shafts of sunlight that slanted across the rug, pouncing with solemn precision. Sage, dreamy as ever, would curl in the crook of Helen's arm whenever she sat down, humming a faint rumble that was almost but not quite a purr. Little Juniper stayed smallest, but she was the quickest to plant herself between her siblings and anything new, eyes narrowed, whiskers forward. They grew, and with them the cabin's quiet changed. Where there had once been the low background hum of the radio, ads for health insurance, retirement planning, and home security systems gently trying to frighten seniors into dialing 1-800-something. There was now a soundtrack of soft thumps, the scrabble of claws on wood, the occasional crash that sent Helen hurrying in from the kitchen with her heart in her throat. She learned to keep breakables high and cabinets latched. She also learned that laughter, even the exasperated kind, came easier with 4 spotted clowns in the house. Lena visited as often as she could. She brought proper formula, tiny veterinary syringes, and later, once baby teeth gave way to something sharper, chunks of thawed rabbit and quail. She weighed them on a bathroom scale, checked their eyes and ears, and made notes on a clipboard. Every time, before she left, she said some version of the same thing. "They're thriving, Helen. You've done wonders. But remember, this is step 1. They can't live here forever." "I know," Helen would reply, eyes on the way, Flint's shoulders rolled under his fur as he paced along the back of the sofa. "I'm just getting them ready for you." It was true, in a way. She had helped raise children and comforted dying men. She knew better than most that nothing stayed, but knowing something with your head and accepting it with your heart were 2 very different kinds of work. The rest of the world didn't make that work any easier. The little video that Earl had posted, just a few seconds of Sage wrestling with a ball of crumpled grocery bag near the wood stove, had made the rounds on the Pine Hollow community page faster than he'd expected. At first, the comments were all hearts and laughing faces, jokes about babysitting fees and sign me up for that pet insurance. But then came a different tone. People worried about safety, about liability, about what might happen if a visitor got scratched and decided to call a personal injury lawyer from one of those loud TV commercials. Sheriff Tom stopped by one afternoon, hat in hand. He watched Bramble leap from the armchair to the back of the couch, then cleared his throat. "Town council's asking questions," he said. "Game and fish, too. Nobody's accusing you of anything. They know you saved these little rascals, but they're getting big, Helen. And big means dangerous, no matter how sweet they look right now." "They're only dangerous if somebody is foolish," Helen said. "I'm not running a petting zoo." "I know, you keep folks back farther than a home insurance adjuster," he said with a ghost of a smile. "Still, Lena's been pushing for a transfer to the larger facility in Flagstaff. They've got outdoor enclosures, proper rehab runs. That's the next step if they're going to have any chance of being wild again." That night, after Tom left, Nathan called from Phoenix. The connection crackled a little, but his frustration came through clear enough. "Mom, I saw that video," he said without preamble. "What are you thinking? Those are bobcats. If one of them rips somebody up and they decide to sue, you could lose the cabin. You don't have the kind of life insurance that covers getting mauled by your own science experiment." "They're not an experiment," she said, keeping her voice level. Flint, sensing her tension, lifted his head from her lap and blinked. "They're orphans, and they're not ripping anyone up." "Not yet," Nathan said. "Look, I talked to a guy I know who works in wildlife law. Technically, what you're doing has been okay because Lena's involved, and they were too small to survive on their own. but the longer you keep them there, the more gray it gets. For your sake and theirs, it's time to hand them off to people with tall fences and tranquilizer darts." He meant well. She could hear it under the sharpness, the same fear that had made him beg her to move into a condo with an elevator and a call button close to his office and a big hospital. Fear didn't always sound kind, but it usually came from love. "I'll talk to Lena," she said at last. "We'll make a plan." The plan came quicker than she'd hoped. A week later, Lena arrived with a state truck, 2 large transport crates, and paperwork thick enough to choke a file cabinet. Helen read each page carefully, the way she had once read consent forms with families in hospital corridors, explaining risks and what might happen next. Her name, the rescue's name, the Arizona Game and Fish Department, check boxes and signatures, and polite legal language that all boiled down to one thing: they were no longer hers. Getting the 4 of them into the crates took the better part of an afternoon. They did not understand why the towels smelled strange, why the air inside the metal boxes was cramped and full of old fear. Bramble went first, lured by a strip of rabbit, then turned and threw himself against the wire door with a wild, outraged yowl that made Helen flinch. Flint flattened his ears and backed into a corner, eyes gone wide and black. Sage tried to pretend the crate was just another new game until the door clanged shut behind him. Juniper was last. She twisted like smoke in Lena's gloved hands, small body all angles and protest. For a moment, as the crate door swung open, her gaze locked with Helen's. Something passed there, something wordless and sharp. Then we vanished inside, and the latch snapped. When it was done, the cabin felt impossibly empty. The crates were carried out to the truck. The climbing shelf looked foolish now, an old bookcase with claw marks. The scratched-up pillows and shredded toys seemed like the aftermath of a party that had ended without saying goodbye. On the porch, in the thin shade of the overhang, Helen and Lena stood together, watching as Tom tightened the last strap across the truck bed. "You can come visit them in Flagstaff before they're moved to the release site," Lena said softly. "We'll keep you updated on every step. You've earned that." Helen nodded, fingers curled around the railing. The wood felt rough under her hand, solid and familiar. "Take care of them," she said. "We will," Lena promised, "and you take care of you. Maybe think about that Medicare Advantage seminar they keep advertising on the radio, so you can keep chasing wild things a little longer." Helen huffed a small laugh at that, but it caught in her throat as the truck pulled away, dust rising behind it. She watched until it vanished around the bend, until the only sound left was the wind in the pines and the faint ticking of her own heartbeat in her ears. When she finally went back inside, the room seemed too big for one old woman and a quiet radio. She stooped, picked up a single spotted hair from the cushion, and sat down slowly, letting the grief come in like the tide, steady and deep. She had done the right thing. Everyone said so. It still felt exactly like loss. Time, Helen had learned, had a way of smoothing the sharp edges off most things. After the truck took Bramble, Flint, Sage, and Juniper away, the days did not stop. They sagged for a while, certainly, like a worn couch cushion, but they did not end. The hens still needed feeding, the tomatoes still needed tying up, Earl still needed his blood pressure checked, and his pills sorted into the little plastic box with the days of the week. Summer came and went, then another. Snow fell and melted. The cabin filled up with quieter sounds again, the radio, the ticking clock, the creak of old boards in the night. The claw marks on the bookcase faded, but never quite disappeared. Sometimes, when she vacuumed along the baseboards, Helen still found a stray spotted hair glinting in the light. Lena kept her word. There were calls from Flagstaff, emails with pictures attached. In one, 4 lanky adolescents lounged in an outdoor enclosure, their coats sleek, eyes bright, paws too big for their still-growing legs. "They're hunting on their own now," Lena wrote. "We're cutting back the human contact to almost nothing. If everything goes well, the release site will be ready by fall. The release, when it came, was only a story for Helen, told over coffee at the rescue office one chilly morning. A gated section of high country forest, miles from any road she'd ever driven, thick with cover and rabbit trails. The truck doors opening, 4 blurred shapes streaking out and vanishing into brush without a single backward glance. "That's good," Lena said firmly, seeing the flicker in Helen's eyes. "That's what we want. No lingering at the fence, no looking back. Wild means wild." Helen nodded. Her head understood. Her heart did what it liked. On the way home that day, she drove a little slower, watching the tree line the way a mother in a school parking lot watched the door where the children came out. Pine Hollow changed too. The logging company finally got its easements, and big trucks began to appear more often on the highway, loaded with cut timber. With them came more strangers, men in dusty pickups, out-of-state plates, cooler chests in the truck bed. Some were just hunters or campers, good enough folks who bought gas and stocked up on snacks and asked about the best trailheads. Others left behind uglier things: bait piles of rotting meat, illegal snares, the occasional spent shell casing where no one ought to be shooting. Sheriff Tom started spending more time on the back roads, his cruiser dustier than ever. He warned Helen more than once to double-check the locks, to keep her phone charged, and that medical alert pendant around her neck when she went to hang laundry or pull weeds. The radio in her kitchen seemed to agree with him. It ran a steady stream of ads about home security systems, medical alert bracelets, and which home insurance policy would treat you right if some fool set the woods on fire. She'd smile wryly and turn the volume down, but she didn't ignore the warnings. The stories started as little things, traded over pie at the diner or whispered in the pharmacy line. A rancher up the valley saw a bobcat, bigger than any he'd ever laid eyes on, standing between his calves and a prowling coyote. A pair of hikers swore they'd heard strange sounds one evening, like several cats calling to each other across a canyon instead of the eerie solo yowl folks were used to. A trucker passing through at dusk told the waitress he'd seen 4 silhouettes on a rock outcropping above the highway, motionless as carved stone, watching the traffic crawl by below. 4, Earl said one night, tapping the table with a crooked finger as Helen checked his pulse. Not 1, not 2, 4. You ever hear of bobcats running together like that? Like a pack of wolves? "Rangers say it happens sometimes with siblings," Helen replied, "if they're released together and there's food enough." "Rangers say a lot of things," Earl grumbled. "All I'm saying is, you raised yourself a little army, Helen. You better hope they remember which side they're on." She made a non-committal sound and went back to her blood pressure cuff. But later, sitting on her porch with a cup of weak tea, she watched the darkening ridgeline with a tightness under her breastbone. Once, as the last light bled out of the sky, she thought she saw movement high up on the nearest slope, 4 shapes slipping through the trees in a line, there and gone, before her eyes could quite focus. Imagination, she told herself, wishful thinking, old eyes. Still, when she went inside, she locked the door more carefully than usual. Not out of fear exactly, more out of respect. The way you might close your door against a storm, knowing the wind itself meant no harm, but could still knock you flat if you weren't ready. Life settled into that uneasy balance. Helen kept volunteering at the clinic, kept her little patch of vegetables alive, kept her Subaru maintained, and her car insurance paid up so Nathan wouldn't fuss. He called every Sunday, like clockwork, talking about mortgage rates and his latest headache at work, trying now and then to nudge her toward a better Medicare plan. She listened, made the right polite noises, and did what she wanted. Then, one warm evening, as June leaned toward July, someone pounded on her front door hard enough to rattle the glass. Helen's heart jumped. For a terrible second, she pictured poachers or some stranger whose GPS had failed looking for directions. When she opened the door, Earl stood there, hat askew, face the color of skim milk. His chest heaved like he'd run all the way up her drive instead of riding in his truck. "Helen," he gasped. "It's Mattie. She didn't come back from that fool camping trip. The boys she was with say she got separated on the trail. Sheriff's called a search party. They're asking everybody who knows these woods to help." Behind him, the sky over the rim was turning the deep bruised blue that meant night would fall fast. Somewhere out there was a scared teenage girl, the same age soldiers had been when they'd clutched at Helen's hands long ago. Somewhere out there, too, were men who set traps and fired rifles where they had no right to be, and perhaps 4 shadows in the trees that had not quite forgotten the sound of her voice. Helen grabbed her jacket without another word. A time was coming when all those threads, the logging trucks, the poachers, the missing girl, and the wild cats she had once held against her heartbeat, would tangle together in ways no one in Pine Hollow could yet imagine. They gathered at the fire station because it was the biggest open building in town, and everybody already knew how to get there. By the time Helen and Earl pulled up, the sky over Pine Hollow was the color of a bruise, and the first stars were fighting through the haze above the rim. Trucks lined the gravel lot, doors slamming as men and women climbed out, carrying flashlights, backpacks, and whatever hope they'd managed to scrape together on short notice. Inside, the big bay smelled of diesel and old smoke. Sheriff Tom stood by a folding table spread with maps, his reading glasses low on his nose. Lena was there too, hair pulled back in a messy knot, a first aid kit the size of a toolbox at her feet. A young deputy Helen didn't know hovered nearby with a clipboard, taking down names. Mattie's mother was on the bench against the wall, hands clenched around a paper cup of coffee that had gone cold. Her eyes were red and wild, fixed on the maps like she could drag her daughter out of the ink with sheer willpower. Earl sat beside her, hat crushed in his fists, shoulders rounded in a way Helen had never seen before. "We're focusing on the loop trail above Willow Lake," Tom was saying. "Her friends say they lost sight of her near the switchbacks. They thought she was right behind them. By the time they realized she wasn't, it was dark, and they panicked. We've got about a 3-mile radius to cover, with a lot of rocks and broken ground. Cell reception is trash up there, and the county can't get the helicopter out until morning." He looked up as Helen approached. "You sure about this?" he asked quietly. "Walking around in rough country at night isn't exactly what most folks your Medicare plan recommends." "If I can walk my own hills, I can walk them for Mattie," she said. "You need people who know the trails. I've been on that ridge more than half the folks in this room." Lena nodded in agreement. "She's right. And we'll keep her with one of the main teams, close to a radio." Tom hesitated, then pointed at the map. "All right. We'll divide into 3 search lines. Team 1 takes the main trail up from the campground. Team 2 cuts in from the old fire road. Team 3," his finger slid to a narrow shaded gash on the topo lines. "We'll need a smaller group to check the box canyon. If she fell in there, she won't be able to climb out on her own." "The box canyon?" someone echoed. "That place eats ankles for breakfast." Helen followed his finger with her eyes. She knew that canyon. It was beautiful in daylight, layers of red and gold rock, junipers clinging to ledges, birds wheeling overhead. In the dark, with loose stone underfoot, it was an accident waiting to happen. "Signal's lousy down there," Tom went on. "Radios will cut in and out. We'll pair one of my deputies with Lena, and I'll take one more person with us who knows the lay of the land." He looked straight at Helen. "You're thinking of that shortcut," she said. "The deer track along the rim." "You showed it to me 20 years ago," he reminded her, "when we were looking for those lost college kids. It saved us an hour then. It might save Mattie tonight." Lena shifted her bag. "We can't send a whole line that way," she said. "Too narrow, but a small team could move fast." "I'll go," Helen said before he could ask. Her own voice surprised her a little with how steady it sounded. I remember every loose rock on that path. I've fallen on half of them. There was a flurry of protest. Earl, Maddie's mother, one of the firefighters, but Tom held up a hand. She'll be with me, he said, and Chris. He jerked his chin at the young deputy with the clipboard. The boy, because that's how he looked to Helen, though he had a badge and a gun, straightened in surprise. He's in good shape. Between the three of us, that's one old head, one medical expert, and one set of knees that still works. Someone made a weak joke about hoping their life insurance was paid up, and the room gave a strained chuckle. Helen thought about her own policies, her home insurance, and the little burial plan Nathan insisted she keep. Funny, the things people worried about when the real danger was standing right in front of them in the shape of an empty space where a child ought to be. They set out while there was still a thin line of light on the western horizon. The searchers fanned into the trees, each team with radios, whistles, and instructions to shout Maddie's name every few minutes. Dogs bayed softly as their handlers unclipped leashes at the trailhead, noses already working the cooling air. Tom's smaller team peeled off from the main group and took the narrow path upward. Rocks crunched under their boots, dry, needles sliding like ball bearings. The smell of sun-warmed pine bled away into colder air as they climbed. "Watch your footing," Helen called back to Chris. "The trail slants toward the drop-in places. You go where your eyes tell you you'll end up on your backside in a hurry." "Yes, ma'am," he puffed. He was trying not to look down. She could tell. The canyon yawned to their right now, a dark seam where the land had split open long before any of them were born. They moved in a slow, careful line, lights sweeping left and right. Every few minutes they stopped and listened. Above them the stars thickened. Below, faint and far away, came the echo of other voices calling Maddie's name. Half an hour in, they reached the point where the deer track narrowed to a shelf barely wider than their boots. The rock wall rose to their left, rough under their palms. To their right, the land fell away sharply. "Radios will start to get spotty here," Tom said, checking his. Static answered him, then Lena's voice, thin and distant. "We're on the other side of the canyon now. Found some scuffed ground and a dropped water bottle. Keep coming." They moved on. Twice, Chris kicked a loose stone, and they all froze, hearts in their throats, listening to it clatter and bounce far below. At a bend in the trail, Helen paused. Something had changed in the air. There was a smell now that didn't belong, old meat and metal and the sour stink of cigarette smoke ground into fabric. Her flashlight beam picked out a dark smear on a rock, and then, a few yards ahead, the dull gleam of spent shell casings half buried in dust. Tom swore under his breath. "Poachers," he said. "They've been using this shelf as a blind. See there?" He pointed to where branches had been cut to open a line of sight into the canyon. "No wonder we've been hearing shots and not finding tracks on the fire road." "Could they have crossed paths with Maddie?" Helen asked. "If they did, and they were just regular hunters, they might have helped her," he said. "If they weren't." He didn't finish the thought. He didn't need to. The radio crackled again, Lena's voice breaking in and out. "Down by the creek bed, signs she might have slid. We're dropping in from the north side. Watch your step." "We're almost above you," Tom answered, leaning into the rock to get a better signal. "We'll cut down through the notch and meet you on the canyon floor." The reply dissolved into white noise. Chris looked from the dark drop to the sheriff, then to Helen. "Sir, if the radios quit completely, then we do it the old-fashioned way," Tom said. "We stick together, we move slow, we keep our eyes open, and we remember we're not the only ones out here tonight." Helen felt the hairs on her arms rise. The wind had shifted again, carrying with it a faint, feral scent she couldn't quite place but knew in her bones. Somewhere beyond the reach of their flashlights, something wild was moving too, its own path weaving closer to theirs. She tightened the strap of her pack, touched the cool metal of her medical alert pendant out of habit, and stepped forward onto the narrow trail leading toward the heart of the canyon. Not knowing that before the night was over, every choice she'd made, from taking in 4 orphans to agreeing to walk this ledge, would come due all at once. The shelf narrowed as they went, squeezing them between the rock wall and the dark drop. Helen's palm skimmed the stone for balance, fingers finding old grooves where water had once run. She could feel her pulse in her fingertips, steady but faster than usual, as if her heart had decided to pick up the pace without asking her first. Below them, the canyon floor was a shadowy ribbon. The air felt different down there, cooler and still, like a held breath. Their flashlights picked out junipers clinging to ledges, a snarl of fallen rock, patches of pale sand where the creek ran only after storms. Every now and then, the wind carried the faint echo of other voices, searchers on the far rim calling Maddie's name. Tom checked his radio again. "Riley to Martinez," he said. "We're above the notch. See anything?" Static crackled back, then Lena's voice, thin and chopped. "We're bottom? Maddie's trail? Creek bed? Watch? Step? Say again?" Tom asked. The only answer was more static. He slipped the radio back on his belt with a tight jaw. "We're on our own for a bit," he said, eyes open. They rounded a bend, and the smell hit them full on. It was riper here. Old blood, rotted meat, the sour tang of men who'd been working hard and hadn't bothered with soap. Helen's beam landed on a tangle of brush cut clean at chest height, opening a clear firing line into the canyon. Beyond it, half hidden between 2 rocks, lay a heap of bones and fur that had once been a deer. "They've been here often," she murmured. A cluster of shell casings glowed dully in the dust, brass against red stone. "Long enough to feel like they own the place," Tom said. His voice had a new edge now, the tone she'd heard in emergency rooms when doctors realized a case was worse than they'd expected. "Keep moving. We're almost to the notch." The notch was where the shelf pinched inward, then spilled into a steep, rocky chute down to the canyon floor. It wasn't a proper trail, just a break in the rock where rain and animals had worn a path over time. In daylight, with good boots and no rush, Helen had taken it dozens of times. In the darkness, with her knees not what they used to be, it looked steeper than she remembered. "I'll go first," she said, angling her flashlight down. "One step at a time, 3 points of contact, just like we taught the kids at the church hikes." Tom followed close behind, Chris after him, breathing a little fast, but steady. Gravel shifted under their soles, trickling ahead of them like dry rain. Halfway down, Helen's toe caught on a buried root, and she stumbled, throwing a hand out to catch herself. Tom's grip clamped around her elbow, hauling her upright before she could go any farther. "Got you," he said. "Don't you dare let me make you fill out more paperwork," she puffed, trying to make light of it. "My life insurance is organized, but I'd rather not test it tonight." His chuckle was brief, more exhale than laugh. "Let's just focus on staying vertical." They reached the bottom without further mishap and paused to breathe. Down here, the world felt different, quieter, but not peaceful. The rock walls rose on either side, blotting out much of the sky. Sounds bounced oddly, the drip of water somewhere, the hiss of wind, the faint metallic clink of... Tom froze. He held up a hand, palm back toward them. Helen stopped where she was, every sense straining. Voices, male, low, just ahead around a bend. The scrape of something heavy being dragged, then the unmistakable chink of metal on metal. He leaned close to her ear. "Stay behind me," he whispered. To Chris he mouthed, "No heroics." They eased forward, hugging the canyon wall. As they rounded the curve, their flashlights picked up 3 figures in the scattered glow of a camp lantern. 2 were on their feet, one hauling a bulging tarp-wrapped bundle across the sand, while the other dug at the base of a juniper with a short-handled shovel. The third sat on a rock, rifle laid casually across his knees, cigarette tip glowing when he lifted it to his mouth. A cooler sat open nearby, and a stack of shadowy shapes, possibly more of the same tarp-wrapped cargo, rested against the wall. "Evening," Tom called, voice calm but carrying. He'd holstered his flashlight low now, beam turned away so as not to blind anyone outright. "Coconino County Sheriff's Office. You boys want to tell me what you're doing down here after dark?" All three men jerked. The one with the shovel went very still. The smoker rose slowly to his feet, cigarette dangling, eyes narrowing as the light caught his face. He was middle-aged, with a scruff of beard and a cap pulled low. His free hand drifted toward the rifle. "Just hunting, officer," he said. "Plenty of folks come out here to hunt. Didn't know you needed a bedtime story and a permission slip." "Hunting's one thing," Tom replied. "Bait piles and illegal traps are another. We've had reports. Mind if I take a look at your tags?" The man sneered. "Mind if I don't?" The air tightened. Helen could feel it, the way she'd felt it just before fistfights broke out in ER waiting rooms. Chris shifted slightly, and the third man, broad-shouldered, younger, stepped closer, putting himself between the cooler and the sheriff. "Hands where I can see them," Tom said now. "No more small talk." His hand dropped toward his. "Own weapon. Nobody has to get hurt tonight, but this isn't your private slaughterhouse." Things happened fast then. The smoker swung his rifle up, faster than a man that age had any right to move. Chris lunged, trying to knock the barrel aside. Someone shouted. A shot cracked, deafening in the narrow space, the muzzle flash painting the canyon walls in harsh white for a heartbeat. Helen flinched back, foot skidding in loose sand. Her heel struck a rock right at the edge of a shallow drop. She'd forgotten about the step down there, the little lip she'd navigated 100 times. This time, her balance was wrong. Her center of gravity shifted. The ground vanished. She grabbed for the nearest thing, rock, root, anything, and her fingers closed for a split second on smooth fabric, someone's jacket, before the weight of her pack pulled her down. The world tipped. Stars and stone traded places. There was a horrible moment of weightlessness, and then she slammed down onto a lower ledge hard enough to knock the breath from her lungs. Pain flared white in her right leg. Something heavy dropped beside her with a crack she felt in her teeth. Her flashlight, shattering, throwing its beam wide, and then dead. Her phone skittered from her pocket, landed face down, screen lighting once, then going dark. "Helen!" she heard Tom shout from above. His voice sounded far away, ragged with something she didn't often hear in it. Fear. She tried to say, "I'm here," but it came out as a gasp. Her leg was wedged deep in a crack between two rocks, twisted in a way that made her stomach roll if she tried to move it. The canyon pressed close around her now, the strip of sky above narrow and pale. Boots scuffed near the edge. A shadow blocked some of the thin light. One of the men peered down at her, eyes sharp, lips pulled back from his teeth. In his hand, the rifle glinted. "Well now," he drawled, "look what the cat dragged in." "Leave her out of this," Tom barked. "It's me you want to argue with, not a 76-year-old woman with a bad knee." The man's gaze flicked upward. 76, huh?" he said. "Looks pretty spry to me, and she's seen our faces. That's a problem." Another voice answered from off to the side, tense. "We're already in it deep, Jake. You start shooting lawmen and grandmas, and you'll have every federal agency from here to D.C. crawling up your backside. We dump the stuff, we run, we disappear. That's survivable. Murder rap? Not so much." Silence hung for a beat. Helen could hear her own heartbeat booming in her ears, could feel every grain of grit grinding against her trapped leg. Above, Chris called, "Sir, he's right. We can still de-escalate this. Nobody's dead yet." The man with the rifle, Jake apparently, cursed under his breath, the sound thin and vicious. He lifted the barrel anyway, not quite pointing it at her yet, but close enough that she could see the dark circle of the muzzle. For half a second, absurdly, she thought of those late-night commercials, the ones where friendly spokespeople explained how a good life insurance policy or a reliable medical alert system could give you peace of mind when things went wrong. None of them ever showed this. Then, from somewhere behind Jake, another sound cut through the canyon. It was low and rough, not loud, but it threaded through the space between stone and sky in a way that made every human sound seem thin. A kind of growl, but deeper, older, like the earth itself clearing its throat. The men went still. Jake's head snapped toward the noise. One of his companions turned in a slow circle, eyes wide, trying to find the source. On the far wall of the canyon, where the rock rose in ragged steps toward the rim, 4 shapes appeared one by one against the dim sky. They moved with the unhurried certainty of things that belonged here far more than any of them did. Low, lithe forms, shoulders rolling, tails flicking once. Helen's breath caught. Even in the weak reflected light, she knew the way they arranged themselves, the way one took the higher ground while the others fanned out. 4 bobcats stood watching them from the stone, eyes catching the faint glow and blazing back gold. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The canyon held its breath. 4 wild shapes stood on the rock like carved figures, tails low, ears forward, eyes burning in the half-light. The biggest of them eased down first, picking a careful path from ledge to ledge. The other 3 fanned out, each taking its own line, the way water finds a way around stones. Helen watched, hardly daring to blink. She knew that rolling stride, the heavy shoulders, the faint kink in one ear. Flint. Bramble dropped in just behind him, more muscle now, but with the same cocky tilt to his head. Sage and Juniper slid along the walls, shadows inside shadows. Jake swore under his breath. "What the, bobcats," one of the other men whispered, as if she couldn't see that for herself. His voice shook. "There's more than one. They don't do that. They're not supposed to do that." Nobody had told the cats. They didn't charge. They didn't scream. They simply took over the space. Flint came to a stop between Helen and the cluster of men, body angled, every line of him saying mine. Bramble climbed a boulder and stared down at the rifles with a steady, unblinking disdain. Sage slid closer to the base of the wall where Tom and Chris were, low and ready. Juniper, smallest but fastest, vanished into a fold of rock and reappeared behind the men, tail just visible. Jake's knuckles whitened on his rifle. "Back off!" he shouted, more to his own fear than to the animals. He fired a warning shot into the air. The noise cracked against the stone and rolled through the canyon in ragged echoes. The bobcats did not run. Flint flinched, his muscles rippling, then settled again, lips peeling, back just enough to show teeth. A sound came out of him, low, guttural, a warning older than any law on the books. Juniper answered with a sharper hiss from behind the men, close enough that one of them spun, stumbling, his boot slipping on loose gravel. "Jake, enough!" the younger man yelped. "They're going to be on us if you keep that up. This is bad, man. This is really bad." In the confusion, Tom moved. He'd been waiting for any break in their focus. While the poacher's attention flicked between fur and teeth and echoing growls, he surged forward, knocking the rifle barrel sideways. Jake fired again, but the shot went wild, chewing a chunk out of the canyon wall. Chris dove for the second weapon, wrestling it away as Sage's snarl rolled through the notch, adding a wild edge to the chaos. "On the ground!" Tom roared, voice filling the space. "Hands where I can see them!" For once, it wasn't just the badge that made grown men obey. 3 sets of human knees hit the sand almost in unison, more out of instinct than compliance, because none of them wanted to turn their back on the 4 big cats that now held the high ground. On the canyon floor, Helen lay very still, trying not to jostle her trapped leg. Pain pulsed with her heartbeat, hot and bright, but under it there was another thrum, something like awe, something like a prayer that had been answered in a language no church ever taught. Flint glanced back at her once, just for a second. His eyes met hers, and in that look she saw not the fuzzy kit from the laundry basket, but the shape of him underneath, the same stubborn line to his jaw. "Good boy," she whispered, though she knew he didn't need her approval. "You remember." From farther down the canyon came shouts and the slam of boots as the rest of the search teams homed in on the shots. Lights bobbed, growing brighter. Lena's voice rang out, sharp with both fear and relief. "Tom! Helen! Where are you?" "We're here," Tom called. "Got 3 suspects down. Helen's over the ledge. Watch your footing, and don't spook the cats." Later, people would argue about what the body cameras showed. They'd replay the footage on local news, slow it down frame by frame. There was no denying the basics. A 76-year-old woman wedged in a crack, 3 men on their bellies with their hands on their heads, the sheriff reclaiming his weapon, and, clear as day, 4 bobcats standing guard around the scene like something out of a storybook with sharper teeth. Lena reached Helen first, dropping to her knees at the edge, her face pale in the flashlight beam. "We've got you," she said. "Just hang on. We're going to get your leg free without making it worse." "Watch where you step," Helen managed. "You've got company." She tipped her head toward the bobcats. Lena's eyes followed and widened. For a second, pure, unfiltered wonder broke through her professional calm. "Oh, my Lord," she breathed, "it's them!" The extraction took time. Ropes appeared, hands braced against stone, careful leverage applied. All the while, Flint and the others maintained their loose circle. They didn't interfere. They didn't vanish. When the final heave lifted Helen clear and settled her on a stretcher, Flint stepped back, just enough, tail twitching. Juniper came a pace closer, nose working, tasting the air around Helen's mud-streaked jacket. "You saved their lives when they were too small to stand," Lena said softly, more to herself than to anyone else. "Looks like they decided the debt wasn't paid yet." It was near dawn by the time they reached the rim again. Someone had found Maddie, shaken and bruised but alive, holed up under an overhang farther down the canyon where she'd slipped and been too scared to move. She rode out in another truck, wrapped in blankets, Earl's arm a firm band around her shoulders. At the edge of the trees, as they lifted Helen into the waiting ambulance, she caught one last glimpse of 4 shapes on the rocks. The first gray light washed over them, turning their coats silver gold. Then, as quietly as they'd come, they slipped back into the pines. In the hospital days that followed, Helen had too many visitors and not enough true rest. Doctors poked and prodded, frowning at x-rays and talking about pins and healing times, while cheerful billing clerks murmured about what was and wasn't covered under her health insurance. Nathan arrived from Phoenix in a rush, hugging her so tight he made her stitches hurt, scolding and fussing and filling out forms. "You scared 10 years off me," he said. "I knew I should have made you move into town. Maybe now you'll let me look over your Medicare plan and that home insurance policy. Just humor your old son for once." She smiled, tired but genuine. "We'll talk," she said, "but I'm not trading my trees for a parking lot, no matter what the commercials promise." News crews came too once Tom's report hit somebody's desk who knew a good story when they saw one. They ran the body cam footage with solemn commentary, circling the moments where the bobcats appeared, where one of them seemed to look straight into the lens. Viewers wrote in from all over, arguing about instinct and imprinting, and whether animals could feel gratitude. Pine Hollow didn't argue much. They'd seen enough. The county prosecutor threw the book at the 3 men from the canyon. illegal hunting, trafficking in protected wildlife, resisting arrest, a list long enough to make even a seasoned defense attorney blanch. The state, embarrassed that poachers had set up shop so close to a town full of witnesses, suddenly found money for more rangers, more patrols, and, at Lena's urging, an expanded high country sanctuary. The new facility near Pine Hollow Rescue was christened the Bramble Sanctuary on a sunny September afternoon, with a small crowd, a modest plaque, and more than a few moist eyes. By the time Helen came home, walking stiffly but without crutches, the aspen leaves had turned gold. Her cabin still smelled of wood smoke and coffee. Earl had kept the hens alive, more or less. Mattie had left a drawing on the table, a lopsided canyon, a little stick-figure grandma with a big smile, 4 spotted cats with tails that went off the page. That evening she sat on her porch with a blanket over her knees, a mug of tea in her hands. Nathan occupied the other chair, phone blessedly tucked away for once, watching the last light fade. Down in the valley, Pine Hollow's few street lights pricked on, tiny stars of their own. "You could have died," he said, not for the first time. "I almost did, a few times," she answered quietly. "In country a lot hotter than this, with less pretty sunsets. We seem to keep dodging that bullet, you and me." He was quiet for a while. "You really think those were your bobcats?" She thought of hot water bottles, of names whispered over tiny ribs, of nights pacing the floor with a bottle in one hand and a towel-wrapped scrap of life in the other. She thought of Flint's eyes meeting hers at the bottom of the canyon and the way Juniper had leaned in to taste the air around her, not quite touching. "I think," she said slowly, "that I gave 4 little lives a chance when the world had just taken everything from them. And when my turn came to be small and scared at the bottom of a hole, something remembered. Maybe it was them, maybe it was the woods, maybe it was the good Lord using whatever tools were handy. Either way, I'll take it." Far up on the ridge something moved. Nathan squinted. "Did you see that?" "I did," Helen said. 4 silhouettes stood for a moment against the darkening sky, tails low, bodies easy, as if they owned every inch of rock under their feet. Flint turned his head, just a fraction, in their direction. The distance between them was too great for any human word, but Helen lifted her hand anyway, a small, steady wave. "Thank you," she whispered. The shapes held still another heartbeat, then slipped back into the trees, as silent as the turning of a page. The cabin at the end of the road settled around her, no longer just a refuge for one old woman, but a small part of a larger circle, of lives saved and debts repaid in ways that left a whole town, and more than a few people watching through their screens, quietly stunned. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Before you scroll away, tell me this. Do you believe a bond like theirs could really exist? If this story touched your heart, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me. And don't forget to subscribe, because the next story might just remind you that sometimes the wild loves us back in ways we'll never forget.